Hello, everybody. This is the Lonely Writers Blog. Happy 4th of July if you're watching this on the 4th of July and you're actually American and you celebrate it. This one is actually, uh, it kind of incorporates the holiday a little bit, not really because of importance or anything as far as writing, but creating a timeline for a story is really important. And this also kind of ties into my last video I did, which is writing a story or starting it maybe years ago, almost a decade ago, and continuing a story over time. And when you have a story, just like when you watch a story that's already been completed, like when you watch your TV shows, we tend not to think about it, but most TV shows that you watch now, they're only in like 2008 or 2009 because that's when the show came out. It starts in that time period, but it doesn't skip 2 years or it doesn't skip 3 years and stuff like that to keep up with time. Some shows do, like Supernatural actually is in 2013. They tend to skip a lot of time. They always find ways to do it in the story where they can actually skip a year or so or 2 years or something crazy like that, and it actually keeps in line so that they can keep in real time. And that's something you have to really keep important within your story. You have to make a timeline and know, if I say it started at this time, then it has to stay at this time. I can't make certain references that wouldn't exist and things like that. And of course, you could always change it to just say, if you started a story years ago, you could just say, well, it happened here. You might have to change some of those references depending on how specific you got with them. But having that timeline, it makes it very important that you know this is where it began, this is the year, this is the time and month and stuff like that. These are some of these references that weren't really old when I started it, but now they're years old because it's taken me years to write this story. And you have to keep that sort of consistent storyline. Like I said, you can't have certain references. If I had a story that took place in like 2008, I can talk about games that have recently come out or TV shows or anime or movies that have been really famous or anything like that because it wouldn't make sense. It takes place in 2009. And that's just something you have to focus on, and you have to decide, if you already placed it within a certain time, do you really want to put in these certain references? And that most likely doesn't apply to a lot of people. I think it's mostly for people like me, where it's like I want to reference a lot of different things because I want to put a lot of my interest into the story that I'm writing and find some way to reference, like, oh, I like this show, so I'll make a character talk about it, or I like this video game, so I'll make a character say that, or little references in dialogue that make sense for that certain timeline. And some things you don't have to be specific. You could say something. They could be at any time. And if it's a movie, you reference a movie that came out in like the 50s, it wouldn't matter what time, what the time is in your story. But you do have to keep a consistent timeline. And sometimes with writing a story over years and years, or even if it's just over a couple of months, it can change how you read the story. You were writing it at one point, it was like, this makes perfect sense. I like these references. I like what they said here and there. And it was just how you felt at that time, even if it's just you as a writer. Your actual timeline in real life does change. So it can, you writing your own story can also change, and it might make you go back and change what you initially wrote because you feel like you could have said it in a better way, or you have experienced something that made you think this would actually sound a lot better. And you have to just keep consistent with that timeline and creating characters. And this is possibly the most important thing, more than just remembering, oh, this is 2009, which isn't much of a problem because you don't really have to say the year. There's no actual reason for people to really say that. And that's why I think most people forget, like, oh, this is taking place in like 2009 or something. Like The Walking Dead, for anyone who watches that or reads the comics, that is in, I believe that is 2009 or 2010, something like that. It might even be before that. I can't remember if it was technically the future when they started the comics, if it, stuff like that. But they mentioned the time, and it's really only been like a year and a half or 2 years in that show, or in the actual comic storyline. But both the series as well as the comic have been out forever. The comic's actually been out for like 10 years or something, or almost 10 years, something crazy like that. And it's only been 12 months or 18 months, something like that, in the actual storyline. So it's just one of those types of things where it's like, we set up a timeline, we can't say certain things because it never existed and stuff like that. So it's always really cool to make sure you have your set timeline, make sure you focus on some of the things you have and focus on your characters so that when you experience something, you can put it into your story, but you don't completely change the character over time. Like that's just something that people would complain about because you have a character who seems like this, and then you as a writer, you change. As of course a writer and a human being, you change over time, different experiences, things like that, and all of a sudden this character who was column A is suddenly like column F for some apparent reason or for no apparent reason to viewers, and it changes who your character is, and you won't really notice it because you're just writing and it's like he was like this, and then you just write a random event and you think this makes sense to me because I lived it, so I'm kind of implementing my life into the story, but it really doesn't, and you're actually changing your character. So it's one of those things where not only do you have to keep a timeline of actual time saying this is a real date that I've created, or if I didn't create a date, then you tend not to have to worry about that, but you always have to worry about your characters and who they become throughout the story. If they stay the same, you have to make sure they actually stay the same, and if you want them to change, you have to make sure that it's not just like boom, it just goes like this and just drops or rises and suddenly they're a new character, because that throws people off and it kind of takes away from your story, and you'd even read it yourself and while you're writing it, it seems perfect, and then you might actually go back and read it, and you'll see where you had that change, and you'll be like, well, I remember this happening and it seemed like it made sense, but now I see how drastically different my one character seems all of a sudden. So keeping a timeline is very important, not just for saying this is the year 20XX or whatever, but for making sure that your characters, the people that you create within your story, have their own timeline, that they grow as human beings or don't grow. Some characters grow, some characters just, they're like, I'm awesome like this, and they just stay that way. But make sure you have a strict timeline for your people, more than time itself, because obviously you can have a story like Doctor Who, and I don't watch Doctor Who or anything like that, and I'm sure they keep it in the actual current time, but they can go all over the place, multiple dimensions, multiple time periods, they do whatever they want. So more than anything, more than actual time itself, make sure your characters stick to their timeline, because no matter what time zone or time or period any character is in, they have to be that same character, and that's something you have to just draw a flat line and say this is how they are, or draw a curve or whatever you need to do, but make sure they have their own real timeline, because they have to grow, they have to be really good characters, and they can't just switch at the drop of a hat unless that's the type of character you wrote. But thanks for checking this one out. I think this is probably my longest one, so really thanks for watching it if you did. If you have any writing advice for anyone who might come across this as far as writing, it doesn't have to be timeline stuff. Any advice you have whatsoever, please put it below. Thanks for checking this out, and please keep watching these if you enjoy them. Thanks.